Listen now for God's word to you. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. This is the word of God for you, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Most of you know that I grew up in Chicago. Well, let me be a little more specific than that. I grew up in the vast expanse of Chicagoland. So I never actually lived in the city, but I still consider myself part of what it means to be from Chicago. And there's two things that really define Chicago for me. It's the food and it's the sports. I love deep dish pizza, Italian beef sandwiches, Chicago-style hot dogs, all the food that Chicago is known for. I love it. It reminds me of home. And I love that here in Kirksville we have the Greek Corner restaurant just a couple blocks from the church. It's a reminder of home for me, but it's also a problem because it's just a short walk and it's not good for the pocketbook or for the waistline. And the second thing I love is the sports. Most people in Chicago are fanatical about our sports teams. I was just a kid when Michael Jordan was in his prime, and one of the great memories for me was watching the Chicago Bulls win all of those championships. But the greatest memory for me was watching the Cubs win the World Series last year. Sorry to all you Cardinals fans. But this was something my family and I have been waiting for generations. My 95-year-old grandmother, who watches every single game, finally got to see the Cubs win a World Series. And unfortunately, we didn't go very far this year, so maybe it'll be another 109 or 108 years. And so on Sundays during football season, my dad and I would come home from church, and we would watch the Chicago Bears play. Being a Chicago Bears fan meant not only that you cheered for the Bears, but you also had a sworn enemy, the Green Bay Packers. My dad and I used to say on Sundays, "I'm cheering for two teams, the Bears and whoever's playing the Packers." We cheered against whoever's playing the Packers because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is my friend describes the relationship between the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees and the Herodians were not allies by any stretch of the imagination, but they did have a common enemy, Jesus of Nazareth. The Herodians were loyal to Herod Antipas, who was named King of the Jews by the Romans. He was one of the sons of Herod the Great, who we remember from the Christmas story tried to kill Jesus when he was just an infant in Bethlehem. And so he was the puppet king ruling over Galilee. And so the Herodians were sympathetic to and supportive of Roman authority and control over the nation of Israel. The Pharisees, however, were committed to keeping the Jewish law down to the very letter. Well, not totally aligned with the common people, they were more populous than their Herodian counterparts. They opposed Roman rule. And so these two rivals come together in order to trap Jesus. They come to Jesus with words of vapid flattery. "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and you teach people what is right. Tell us, should we pay taxes to the emperor or not?" This was a contentious question in Jesus' day. The Romans had conquered huge amounts of territory around the Mediterranean world, and so they required their subjects to pay an annual tax for being part of the empire. This tax was used to help pay for the cost of having the Roman legion in your land. And so the Jews of Palestine and other subjected people were literally paying to have the Romans in their territory. They were literally paying to be occupied. They were literally paying to be controlled by the Romans. So the tax that's in question in this passage requires a special coin. The coin had the image of Caesar with the phrase, Tiberius Caesar, divine son of Augustus, high priest. So this is a theological claim on the coin. There was no separation of church and state in the ancient world. And so the money used to pay this tax was claiming divine power and authority to Caesar. So the tax was more than a question of a monetary transaction. It was more than a question of if it's just to pay this tax to your Roman overlords. Certainly these were important questions, and certainly these were questions that people asked. But ultimately, it's a question of allegiance. The coin is saying something about Caesar and something about his claim on your life. So can you give to Caesar what's due to Caesar? For the Jewish population living under Roman rule, this was an issue. The Ten Commandments specify that there was no other God besides God, and that there should be no graven images. By paying this tax, many of the religious leaders saw a violation of these two commandments. You have Caesar claiming divine status, and you have his graven image on this coin. So the question was, can someone who's part of the people of God carry around a coin with the graven image of the emperor that proclaims him as God? And so they asked Jesus, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to the emperor or not? They think they have him trapped. If he says they shouldn't pay taxes to the emperor, the Herodians have won, because they reveal Jesus to be seditious and rebellious against Rome. If he says they should pay taxes to Rome, then the Pharisees will win, because he shows himself to be unfaithful to the Jewish law and violating the first two commandments. Either way, Jesus loses the crowds. For quite some time, the political and religious leaders have been trying to arrest Jesus, but they've been unable to because, as Matthew writes, they fear the crowds. And so Jesus has been untouchable because of this popular support. But with this question, he will lose the crowds, and they will finally be able to arrest him. How is Jesus going to get out of this one? They seem to have him trapped. Is he going to show himself to be seditious or idolatrous? But Jesus says, bring me a coin that's used for the tax. Notice that Jesus doesn't possess the coin, but his accusers do. They want to know if it's lawful for him to pay the tax, but he doesn't even possess the coin. They do. And so Jesus takes the coin, and I imagine he looks at it for just a moment, and he holds up the coin and says, whose image and inscription are on this coin? The emperor's, they say. Then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and give to God the things that are God's. This is a pretty sick burn. They thought they had him trapped. They thought they could expose him either as a seditionist or as a colluder with Rome, but in the end, he's neither of those things. Caesar has imprinted his image on a coin, therefore give it to him. The Pharisees and the Herodians see so much power in this coin, but Jesus sees it as powerless. Caesar thinks he can have claim over their lives by forcing them to pay tribute, but ultimately it's worthless. Richard Spalding says, Caesar spread his image far and wide, but he cannot come close to the true commerce that truly animates us. Give to Caesar his image on a cold, lifeless coin. This coin will be lost to history. It will have to be dug up and studied by archaeologists to figure out exactly what it was. It doesn't animate you. It doesn't make you who you are. What makes you who you are is what's given to you by God. So therefore give to God the things that are God's. So what are we supposed to give to God? Or better yet, as several commentators have asked, who or what bears the image and the inscription of God? It's all of us. Caesar might have imprinted his image on a coin, but God has imprinted God's image on all of us. It goes back to the very beginning of our story. In Genesis 1, God creates order out of chaos. God creates the beauty of the world we live in, trees, animals, and oceans. God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. Everything we see around us was created by God and belongs to God. One of the things that I enjoy about Kirksville is how well I can see the stars at night. I've spent most of my life living around major metropolitan areas, so all the light pollution kind of blocked out the stars. And so every night when I take the dog out for the last time, on a really clear night, I can look up and see the stars and the moon, and I'm amazed at the immensity of the world which God created. But the God who made all of this also made you and I. That we weren't just another part of creation, but we were created from the dust of the earth, and God breathed into us the breath of life. And so we are intimately connected to God's very being. God, when God breathes the breath of life into us, makes us in God's image. We bear the imprint and the mark of God. The image of God is reflected in our bodies and in our lives. To give to God the things that are God's are to give our very selves and our very lives to God. Because ultimately, it's God's image that's been imprinted in our lives and on our very being. Imprints and images are representatives of the real thing. The image of Caesar represents Caesar. Caesar wants to maintain power and dominance. Caesar wants to maintain the status quo. He wants things to remain the same. And so to remind people of his power, he freezes a static image of himself on a coin and reminds people of how he wants to form them in his image. But the image of God is found in the dynamic lives of humankind. That we as human beings are ever changing, ever growing, and ever transforming. God is reflected in how we continue to grow and transform to be more like God and to be more like Christ. The image of God is found in the frailty of human life. It's found among us in our weaknesses, in our sufferings, and in our inability to get it right. The image of God is found in all the people that Jesus meets along the way throughout his ministry. What I wish that Jesus had done when he was asked if he should pay taxes to the emperor and showed the inscription of the emperor, is that he would have looked around at all the people gathered there, all the people who followed him, the lepers, the sick, the poor, the women. And then he would have looked at the Herodians and the Pharisees, and he would have said, whose image and inscription are on all of these people and on you? And they would have had to say, God's. Give to God the things that are God's. Give to God the image you bear, marked with the love and grace that comes from the one to whom we ultimately belong. Caesar's image might be found on the coin and currency that makes the empire run, but God's image is found in the faces of all of us here today. God's image is found in what animates us and what makes us who we are. We aren't static. We have bodies that breathe and smile and speak. We have bodies that serve and love and act with compassionate care for one another. We create art and music. We share in conversation and fellowship with one another. We are always growing and always changing and always transforming. These are reflections of who God is because God is not static. God is one of creativity and beauty and compassion and love and service. They represent the dynamism of who God is. We as the image of God are dynamic because God is dynamic. As we reflect the dynamic nature of God, we are reflections of God's image. Giving to God the things that are God's is giving our lives in service to one another and to God. It's using our creativity to create music and art that adds beauty to our world. It's seeing the image of God in one another and advocating for peace and justice for those who are oppressed or downtrodden. It's using the love of God within us to care for those around us who are lonely or friendless. It's using our compassion to care for those who are sick and suffering. It's using our intelligence and imagination to think beyond easy and tired answers and to advocate for the renewal of the world. The Pharisees and the Herodians are concerned about the image on a coin. But what Jesus is concerned about is the image of God imprinted on all of them and on all of us. Give to Caesar what he's owed, but even more than that, give to God what's God's. Give to God your life because you belong to God and not to Caesar. And so the question we're left with at the end of this story is, what ways can we use our God-given image to give back to God the things that are God's? Amen. I invite you to rise as you are able as we will sing hymn 408, Where Cross and Crowded Ways of Life.